Sorry, now, okay? Okay, first of all, thank you, Professor Reichman, for your introduction. I also want to thank the organizers of this amazing conference. I feel like I've come one way yesterday and really felt, when I say a formative moment, several formative moments yesterday during the keynotes and different conversations I had with scholars that took part in this conference. Also, I want to thank Dr. Shlomi Balaban, Shlomi here, yeah, for is part of the reason that I'm here, or the whole reason that I'm here, and Professor Michelle Greenberg. Both of them have been part of this journey, making us strong to be able to do this as our advisory board. So thank you so much. Can you hear me well? Great. Okay. So I'll just say that we were asked to talk about our lived experiences as academics since October 7th, the actions that emerged from this crisis, the powers that we found within ourselves to respond to the reality around us, and also the connection to anti-Semitism and how it shaped our work. So I truly appreciate that opportunity, and I will speak about the role of legal discourse and documentation in the fight against anti-Semitism. If it's okay, I will open with a short 90 seconds video with the testimonies that we collected since October 7th and that are part of our archive. Let's see. One moment. I apologize. This is, although it's 90 seconds, I did hear people say that it's difficult 90 seconds, so I want to, if someone wants to leave, it's about the documentation of the sexual violence. Oh, okay. I thought that you're leaving. Okay, thank you.
הצמיד אגרוף לחזה שלי, זה לחץ, אז הוא אמר לי שאני אוריד את התחתונים.
ראיתי אותה שהם אונסים אותה. הם תפסו אותה ושמענו את הצורחת. צרחות של צורחת על החיים, כאילו.
זה היה צחוקים, זה היה דחקות, זה היה להעביר אותם מאחת לשני. הם חגיגו שם. את שומעת את הצעקות, ואז את שומעת שקט.
אחת הבנות חוזרת, ואנחנו כולם יודעים שמשהו קרה. ואז היא סיפרה לנו שהוא נגע בה.
He started touching me and I resisted, and then he dragged me to the bedroom.
השמלה שלה הייתה מופשלת כלפי מעלה, והרגליים שלה היו מפוסקות. למה זה מה שצריך לזכור ממנה?
Disfiguring their faces and their sexual organs. You'd see that multiple times.
It's like they wanted to inflict pain in the cruelest manner possible. They have redefined evil.
גופה של ילדה, ומרחוק אני כבר מבין שהיא ערומה כולה. המקום האינטימי שלה ממש פצוע, מדמם, הוא כאילו ממש כולו מדמם.
So funny that I saw this like a million times and it's still difficult. So one of the questions that has occupied me since October 7th is not only how would we as a society or the institutions around us respond to the mass atrocity, but how they respond when the atrocity itself immediately became contested. As a legal scholar, I really expected very early solidarity, compassion, perhaps debates over responsibility, debates over responses to trauma, accountability, victims' rights. What I did not anticipate was the struggle over whether the violence itself could be established as a fact, and specifically the sexual violence. Within days, there was already a battle over the truth, over victims' and survivors' testimonies, evidence, their credibility, the credibility of films that were taken by the terrorists themselves in which they glorified their violence. For those of us working on gender issues, sexual crimes, it became clear that we were not operating in a sympathetic environment or even a neutral environment. We experienced hesitation, hatred, denial, silence, sometimes by respected institutions, professionals, scholars, that over time became more and more sophisticated. It served a role in fueling anti-Semitism worldwide, in doubting what Jews, what Israelis are saying. Speaking here about our lived experiences, while we were witnessing the sexual atrocities, while we were bearing the trauma of collecting these testimonies, of viewing the materials that at times really made us physically ill, simultaneously we were confronting very organized efforts to deny, relativize, or politicize the evidence itself. I remember very early after the attack at the UN speech that I delivered, that I asked them, is there international law for Israeli women? Is it going to protect us? Thinking to myself, again and again, are we even human? Can they express really minimal solidarity and empathy with the victims? Can they call for the return of the hostages that were taken so violently? So I won't talk about what it felt that and how it kind of shook the core of my intellectual, home that I felt. That experience really has led me to think differently about the relationship between legal documentation and anti-Semitism. I increasingly see anti-Semitism not only as a form of hostility directed toward Jews, but also as something that operates epistemically. It affects the conditions under which knowledge is produced, circulated, and believed. It introduces instability, not only around Jews, but over truth itself. What can be said, what can be believed, what can be accepted as credible, whose victimhood is accepted or denied, which narratives are preserved in the historical environment we're here. This realization guided us. This became particularly visible in relation to the sexual violence. Victims of sexual violence are extremely vulnerable. The truth about this violence, and maybe I'll add, not only victims of sexual violence, but also witnesses of sexual violence or of sexual trauma. The truth about this kind of violence is fragile, fragmented. As someone whose academic work has long been grounded in feminist legal theory, I entered this work with a deep commitment to principles that have shaped feminist jurisprudence for decades, feminist action. The testimony deserves careful attention, that women should be believed, that victims of sexual violence should be believed, men or women. The trauma affects the way victims speak. So early we were attacked by whether we share the information or not share the information. The documentation is essential for accountability, that victims should be believed, recognized. The ability to tell a person, I know what you've been through. I know that you've been through hell. Yet after October 7th, I found these assumptions did not operate consistently. The evidentiary threshold appeared to shift, if it existed. Basic compassion was absent. The moment you tell a victim, a nation, a people, as I said, that we believed. As an international legal scholar, I can tell you that the softest mechanisms of international law failed. My students often ask me, it's the first class, what is the power of international law? And my response is very, telling them that values matter, that universal human rights matter. But after October 7th, I really saw these truths being, undermined. Jewish victims often encountered demands for levels of corroboration that would rarely be expected elsewhere. The question was no longer simply whether sufficient evidence existed, but whether Jewish and Israeli-based testimony could acquire legitimacy in the first place. As I said, that realization fundamentally shaped the work of the Civil Commission. I can tell you that we operated under conditions in which we felt we have to follow the strictest international protocols. From the outset, we understood the documentation itself had become part of the intervention, part of justice, part of combating anti-Semitic narratives. We therefore adopted rigorous legal methodologies, extensive corroboration, multidisciplinary review, and standards drawn from international criminal investigators, prosecutors that guided us from the very beginning. Not only because these are good research practices, but because, because we were afraid, but because the evidentiary environment itself had become contested. We weren't afraid for ourselves. We were afraid that the victims, the reality of what the victims have endured would disappear. After months of immersing ourselves in the depth of human suffering, in testimonies, in visuals, we were able to put forward really the most comprehensive legal foundation for the crimes. We established a secure archive. I want to say this because I want you to know that we've created this foundation, this substantial evidentiary foundation, shifting the global conversation finally from questions of whether these crimes happened to what are their consequences. You know, once the report was released, I understood that finally we can confront the reality of the crimes, the reality that they existed, and what it looks like. The understanding that we know more than national security experts of what happened, that we understand the dynamics or see the terrorists again and again and again, it was difficult. And now I'm finally happy that we were able to create a conversation or start a conversation around that. The experience of documenting the sexual atrocities also revealed another limitation. I want to say that existing legal vocabulary was often insufficient. We found it often insufficient to describe what we were documenting. Again and again, survivors' experiences exceeded existing legal categories, and I want to talk about the hostages. They spoke for hours, and we weren't sure. I'm sure that we failed in really capturing the reality of hell, of sexual violence on a daily basis, and the fear of being taken into captivity in such a hell of reality. That realization also led us, the documentation, of the sexual violence also led us to develop a concept that we name as kinocide or kinocidal sexual violence. Kinocidal sexual violence, it's our way to refer to the torture of families through sexual violence. We documented one case, for instance, of hostages that were forced to commit sexual acts on one another, or families that were family members that were forced to see sexual violence against one of their relatives. I'm saying that because we needed to create new terminology, not for its own sake, but because legal language shapes legal recognition. After speaking with so many victims, not only those who saw sexual violence, but also family members that saw the torture of one another, we understood that giving name to those crimes gives language to the victims to describe what they have endured, what they've been through. I often say that Hamas allowed us a window to hell through their documentation. So when law lacks concepts, certain harms remain difficult to articulate, analyze, and ultimately address. For me, this has broader implication for the study of anti-Semitism. If anti-Semitism can operate by undermining the credibility of Jewish testimony, of Israeli testimony, and destabilizing the production of knowledge and documentation is not merely a technical legal exercise. Documentation then became an epistemic practice, a historical act, and ultimately, when I say democratic act of bringing knowledge into the public sphere. I want to talk about the role of scholars, researchers, academics, legal institutions today, I think, is to preserve victim stories, to preserve what they tell us now in the present. You know, you asked me, Professor, and I'm finishing almost, I'm almost done. You asked me, what can we do now? And this is part of it. We need to document what victims are saying. We need to document the reality of what happened here and own our stories. And I think really academic scholars have responsibility in that. So in many ways, and our report is a theoretical intervention in a complex reality. It is founded on the realization that anti-Semitism has an epistemic dimension, and that in that realm, legal documentation function as a form of epistemic resistance. In our case, feminist resistance, humanistic resistance. And I want to ask all of you today to engage with the report. If you can, read parts of it, write about it, study it, share it, put it in your syllabus. Feel free to take part in this conversation as experts yourselves. And I want to end by a more hopeful note and say that I truly, truly believed and believed from the very beginning that truth prevails. Over time, truth prevails. And I was recently asked, and I share it in every talk since, if something is missing in this 300 pages report, if I could add a line, what would it be? And it made me think that if there is one line I would add, is that one thing that guided us through this process, or at least gave me strength, is understanding that in this world there is the same amount of goodness as there is evil. The evil that we're seeing is not all-encompassing. It's just part of the reality we are living. But we need to believe in goodness that exists in people, in our reality, and in humanity itself. Thank you so much.